Dr. Rajan, welcome to the show. It's morning for you, I know that, so thank you for doing this. I'll
Thank you
start
for
with
having
the obvious question because you're not here. You're trending today on Twitter in India. I don't know if you know that.
I don't. I don't actually follow Twitter.
Well, I do, and you tend to trend quite often. There's a way in which you've become a sort of bogeyman for followers of the present regime, supporters of the present regime. It's almost as though when their children don't sleep at night or misbehave, they say, "Watch out, Raghuram Rajan is going to come and get you." How does that feel? Because you've never been portrayed in such terms before.
No, I think there's a sort of campaign to discredit me, and
Yeah.
what they do is they take phrases out of context and then push it as hard as they can. But this has been going on for some time. It went on while I was governor RBI also, and I sometimes you feel it's orchestrated, and it is sometimes. And sometimes it's just let's try and be sensational because we don't have any other news. So it's a mix. I think the what I keep insisting is read the whole. Even interviews, as you well know, are sort of cut and so as to try and emphasize the new stuff, which tends to be sensational.
Yeah.
But if you listen to me talking, you'll hear what I'm saying, and that's what you should focus on.
Well, I can understand now why they're going for you, but why when you were governor of the RBI? Because that was a sort of policy job. You didn't really express any political views.
Well, there were a couple of things that were going on. I think that we were initially raising interest rates to bring inflation down, and a bunch of people who had borrowed a lot suddenly started feeling the pinch. And I got a bunch of threats from business people saying, you better do it, otherwise we'll get you out of your job. And
Really?
and the, yeah,
These
absolutely.
were like influential business people who were in a position to do that, you think?
Well, sometimes business people have a greater sense of their influence
They do, yes.
than they actually have.
And sometimes
No,
that
but
influence than we
the
realize.
point was the point was if I succumb to to their threats, then I'd be out of a job anyway because I'd be doing my job awfully. So you just ignore it and go on and do your things. But the other part was we started cleaning up the banking sector and forcing people to repay loans, and that too didn't go down well. So if you want to speculate, there are always conspiracy theories you can subscribe to, but I'll leave it at that.
But let's talk a little bit about your coming back to become governor of the RBI. At that stage, you were one of the most celebrated economists in the world. You'd predicted the recession. People from all nationalities were beating a path to your door. And yet you sort of turn away from the world stage and you come back to India and you start working for the Reserve Bank. What made you do it?
Well, there's nothing more fulfilling than working for your country and moving the needle.
Hmm.
I think both are important. I mean, you can work for your country and do very little. Uh, and, to some extent, if you're in the ministries, that tends to be the case because you're so hemmed in by, the bureaucracy, by other sort of political interests that you can't do very much. But in the RBI, it's a professional organization. And there were many evenings when I left the place and I said, today we moved the needle. We opened up licensing for banks. We licensed a large number of them. We started UPI at that time. We brought in an inflation targeting regime, which I think has stood us well over the last few years because inflation has remained relatively contained. And of course, we started cleaning up the banks. And so when you see in your time inflation come down from 10% to 5%, you feel a sense of, well, we have done something because for the ordinary person, inflation does bite.
When you were at the RBI and you took a decision, did you think of how it would affect the ordinary person, or was it done at sort of elevated policy level where it was all macro, and you didn't really think of the micro effects on people?
No, in India, you have to think. I mean, one way to bring down inflation is to kill the economy. right? You raise interest rates so high. And the problem with that is our poorest people don't have any buffers. And when I say poorest, it's really more like the bottom 75% rather than something like the bottom 20. They don't have any buffers. So if you sort of reduce the number of jobs, you reduce economic activity, you're essentially condemning them and their children to absolute misery. It's not like the US where you have unemployment insurance and so on, where people can go on the dole for a while. And so you have to be very careful about, you can slow the economy, you can't kill it. And that requires calibration.
Most famously, while you were working, there was another person who'd been governor of the Reserve Bank before you, who was also in government. So did you talk much to Dr. Manmohan Singh?
Oh, yes. He was very supportive. He is, obviously a brilliant economist who made it through every position of government.
Yeah.
And, people don't credit him enough with also political acumen. He may not have been a politician, but he had political acumen.
Really,
So
give me an
you have-
example, because the criticism most often levied against him is he may have been a good economist, but he really had no idea of politics.
Well, just even in the way he brought me into the system, his sense was that, you need, I'm an outsider, you need to bring them in by, ensuring that they sort of show their colors before they're entrusted with something as important as the RBI. So he, along with Dr. Rangarajan, brought me in as chief economic advisor, which is sort of an important post, but not critical. It doesn't matter if the chief economic advisor goes off the rails, but because that can be contained. But you can't contain an RBI governor who goes off the rails. And so, I was, it also, I mean, while I think we had established trust, this allowed others in the party, in the government, to observe me, and allowed me to work with Mr. Chidambaram, who would make, along with Dr. Manmohan Singh, the final decision. And so it sort of paved the way.
What was the difference working with Mr. Chidambaram, who is known for being a man who knows his own mind and does not have a reputation, shall we say, for being particularly flexible, and Dr. Manmohan Singh, who's seen as a gentler figure? Is that caricature accurate?
No, well, they're different people, of course, both very, very smart. I think Dr. Manmohan Singh, has a more, what's the right word, enabling personality. He sort of wants to sort of figure out what you want and work with that. Mr. Chidambaram has strong views of his own, for sure, but it's not as if he didn't listen. He was always open and receptive to ideas. In fact, he desperately wanted ideas. He's a man who, what is interesting about Mr. Chidambaram's manner of working is he wants to find the person who knows.
Yeah.
If it's the secretary, that's fine. But if the secretary doesn't know, he's quite willing to go to the deputy secretary who knows and, talk to him, tell me what I want to know and tell me why I'm wrong. It's not that he's unwilling to be contradicted.
Really?
But he genuinely wants people who know their subject.
Did you actually contradict him and ever get him to change his mind?
Yeah, we've had a lot of conversations, tried to persuade him of this or that or something else, and yeah, it's been very. I think what's important is you have to earn his respect.
Yeah.
He has to believe that you know something.
Which surely your case was not a problem, right?
Well, I had to learn a lot about India.
Yeah.
What was interesting was in the middle of a conversation with a foreign dignitary, he turned to you and say, "Yes, so therefore the birth rate in Tamil Nadu is," and sort of stretch your-
And would you know
I
it,
mean,
or did you sort of improvise?
Well, I knew it sometimes. Sometimes I knew ballpark. Sometimes I had to say, "Look, I really don't know." figure out. We'll find out, so I'll let you know.
But when you deal with Mr. Chidambaram or you deal with Dr. Manmohan Singh, you're dealing with people with experience of economic ministries. Chidambaram is not an economist, but he's done enough economics in government. What was it like when you dealt with Mr. Jaitley, who was a lawyer with no economic background?
Well, so Mr. Jaitley was again very, very. I mean, they're obviously smart people who come into their position because they sort of understand how to put two and two together.
Yeah.
I think Mr. Jaitley was less sort of interested in the economics relative to, say, a Mr. Chidambaram, but he was much more engaged on how to make things possible politically. So he, he looked at the economic problem also from a political perspective. How can we make this happen? So that was, I mean, the different interests, different emphasis. I mean, there were different personalities, but both, as you know, extremely eminent lawyers.
Sure.
And so they could get to the gist of the arguments very quickly.
So there is a perception that you didn't really get on with him. Is that accurate or inaccurate?
Totally inaccurate.
Really?
Yep. I got along with both prime ministers I worked with, as well as both finance ministers. I think the issues were outside.
Explain that. I mean, you can't leave that open-ended. What were the issues then?
No, I think there were a couple. I mean, one was I had my own sense of discomfort with growing majoritarianism.
Yeah.
And as a public official, you want to be careful about bringing your organization into disrepute when or into controversy when talking about it. But as I said, the people looking for controversy did follow me because I was one of the few who was willing to speak out on some issues. And I thought the issue of
give me an example of an issue that you spoke out.
So I used to speak on inflation and so on, and again, you didn't want to send the wrong message. So Mr. Jaitley suggested, why don't you speak on non-economic issues? Because that then takes away this thing from because I got invited to a lot of speeches. I either you give a totally boring speech, in which case they look for controversy within the speech and manufacture it, or you give them something to work on. So I started moving to non-economics, economics, but not related to monetary policy. But what was important was, as the environment of intolerance started increasing, I thought it was important for public figures to say that was not the India that was intended. And you wanted a more inclusive India. So I used, importantly, one platform, the IIT Delhi convocation, where I was giving the convocation speech to say why, respect and tolerance were really important for India, and that our history suggested that people like Akbar, which was a red flag to some, and Raj Shora and others had over time set up an environment of tolerance. It was in our history. And it would be a shame to get away from it as we get near the frontiers of economics, where debate, creativity is really important. So
I remember that speech, and I wondered if you'd realize the impact it would have before you made it.
I absolutely realized the impact, but that was the intent. Okay. But it was not.
It was deliberate. I mean, using Akbar around that in many contexts is non-controversial. But given the environment you were in, it was certain to be a red rag, no?
It was deliberate, but it was also I was going back as an IIT Delhi alumnus, talking to the to young graduates and giving them a message of hope and of idealism. And it was in that context that I thought it was important I should speak, rather than to the FICCI or somebody else when I would be expected to speak as RBI governor, talk about economics. And actually, I met Mr. Jaitley the next week, and he said, I would have said everything you said. And I said,
Really?
yeah, absolutely. He said, I've been saying this. In fact, he said something more. He said, I've been saying the same thing, which was interesting. This was after the speech started getting the usual controversy. So that's an example of people, respect and tolerance.
What you said is very interesting. So did you have the sense with Mr. Jaitley, who you clearly have respect for, judging by the things you've said, that he also didn't want a very majoritarian, sort of oppressive India? He appreciated the diversity and plurality of India?
Well, I don't want to go to the extent of knowing his thinking. I don't.
In your conversations with him, shall we say?
Look, he is urbane. He is not your expletive spouting street radical.
Yeah.
And it is easy to find common ground. Now, whether he would stand up to something which was against, whether he would stand up against certain forms of majoritarianism that we've seen, I don't know. But I would say that he certainly wouldn't lead the charge. Either way, he won't.
You're saying he was a nice fellow, a chap you could talk to who was urbane, and perhaps even if he didn't approve of some kind of expletive sprouting majoritarian or whatever, he may disapprove silently, but he would not lead the charge against them. That's really what you're saying.
I mean, that I don't want to sort of frame him in that thing, but if I were to sort of gauge his thinking, it would be that he would not be leading the charge on either side, either towards the majoritarianism or against it.
Did you get the sense then, because there was so much controversy on social media, a lot of it, as you suggested, orchestrated, did you get the sense that the government wanted you out?
I think certain elements clearly were not happy. Certain elements certainly did not see me as conforming, and I don't want to entirely dissociate this from business interests either.
Exactly.
I think business interests have political connections, and those political connections then work in their interests silently or explicitly.
So, Dr. Rajan, forgive me if I'm caricaturing what you're saying, but what you're saying is that there were business interests who felt they would be adversely affected by the cleanups and the things you were doing, and they lobbied to have you removed. There were elements within the ruling dispensation who didn't like it because you stood up for your vision of India, which was not their vision of India. And ultimately, perhaps there was a coincidence of interest, and that contributed to your exit.
Well, I think the point you have to ask is, given my performance, why didn't we get to a point of agreement in my continuation with the government? And so you have to go beyond the he raised interest rates or whatever. In fact, I cut interest rates throughout during the BJP regime to look at interests. And I mean, you mentioned a couple. There could be so many more. It doesn't give me sleepless nights. I don't think about it. I think what I did was the right thing for India. I feel very confident and proud of the record we established over that time, and I think it's helped India over the years since. The cleanup we started of the banking system has proceeded to the point where the banks, by and large, have clean balance sheets and can lend as the nation sort of starts growing. UPI is such a flourishing system now. Of course, success has many fathers. I think the true father is Nandan Nilekani, but I feel I played a small part in that. And similarly, some of the banks we started, I see branches on. We licensed. I see branches on all around, and I say, well, that's a bank we gave a license to. I feel happy.
Does it surprise you when, let's take UPI? There's now a campaign on Twitter and social media to say this Rajan guy is claiming credit for UPI. He had nothing to do with it. There's an attempt to airbrush your achievements or Photoshop them to what really happened and attribute them to other people. Have you noticed that?
Well, this is politics, right? So, I mean, take the even the finance minister sort of gets into the act and says, "Oh, he presided over phone banking."
Yeah.
I was in the which is the process of the political establishment calling banks to lend to their favorite sort of industrialists. I was in the UPA government for 8 months, in the NDA government, NDA government for
BJP
28 months.
Yeah.
28 months. So when did this phone banking take place? During the 8 months I was with the UPA, or the 28 months I was with the NDA? I mean, this is just political, talk. What we really did was started the cleanup of the banking system. And I remember, I mean, Ms. Sitaraman wasn't there. I was with Mr. Jaitley. I remember going to Mr. Jaitley and saying, this is going to cost you. But if we don't clean up the system, you will have to take more and more blame for the size of the NPAs that build up. And it will not be possible for you to blame the previous government at that point. We have to start the cleanup now, and it will cost you money. And when we did the cleanup, we were assessment. We were amazed at how much it would cost, given the bad loans that had accumulated. And so I went back to him again, and I said, "This is the amount." But to his credit, he was perfectly supportive. He said, "If it has to be done, it has to be done."
Okay. Because the view that is now current in sort of conventional wisdom is that the UPA gave loans to very dodgy characters. The banks were stuck with non-performing assets, and then they got rid of you and they cleaned it all up.
No, I think we started the whole process of cleanup. In fact, they were upset because we were cleaning up rather than, that they got rid of me and cleaned it up. But see, this is the narrative. Oh, he raised inflation. Well, no, inflation was close to double digits when I came in. When I left, it was 5%. We brought it down significantly. In fact, we brought it down within the range that we could implement the inflation targeting regime. They didn't want to do it in my time because that would give me a last success. They did it under Urjit Patel. But that regime was fully negotiated, ready to go at the end of my time. And it stood us in good stead. It has kept inflation relatively contained in the face of widespread global disruption. So, I mean, because they see me as part of the opposition. The problem with this establishment is anybody who criticizes is seen as opposition and political, rather than they are criticizing because there's reason to criticize, because you are doing something wrong. Of course, this government wants to believe it can do nothing wrong. And of course, the whole hordes who are enlisted in the trolling attacks basically don't think for a moment. They're empty-headed.
And they're following a script, right?
They're following a script, absolutely. So, whenever I say something, it has to be, he's such an idiot. He's such a this thing. And the script includes, such fake news as inflation went up in his time, bad debts went up. No, bad debts were recognized in my time. That's why they went up. They were already there, and they were, holding the banking system back. But these subtleties escape them because.
But inflation, it's difficult to lie about because those figures are there. It's clear that you managed to control inflation, and you did it without a very tight monetary policy, without causing difficulties for ordinary people, which in most cases would be considered a substantial achievement. But here it's sort of the narrative is rewritten to say that inflation zoomed under you.
Yeah, no, of course. And even interest rates, right? I was against the BJP, therefore I kept interest rates. No, I cut interest, I raised interest rates during the UPA regime because that was when inflation was high. Then we kept it steady and cut by, if I remember correctly, over 175 basis points during the BJP regime. So to argue I was a fifth column of the UPA trying to, why would I cut if I was part of the fifth column? I mean, look,
When do you think all this started? Because you come to India and you become chief economic advisor. At that stage, you're internationally renowned. You've predicted an economic crisis. You've been a star at the IMF. You're seen purely as a technocrat. And yet, if you see the narrative now, you were always like a UPA stooge, always anti-BJP, always political. When do you think that perception changed?
so it's very interesting. I worked with the NDA first installment also, fairly closely with Mr. Yashwant Sinha, and he acknowledges the fact that I've, offered some useful advice in his book. And I have great respect for Mr. Yashwant Sinha. I think he was one of India's finance ministers.
Really?
Because he took the process of reform head on and he continued, which was important because we were slowing down. NDA 1 did a bunch of reforms. We didn't show up in outcomes until UPA took over. But I think the initial years of success were in part, and this is what, this government, nothing happened before 2014. Everything happened after 2014 that is good. I mean, that is,
And especially after they got rid of Rajan, not just after 2014. They really
well,
got rid
no,
of.
they can't wait that long because the highest year of growth was 2016 in my last year so they can't eliminate me completely because growth actually picked up quite strongly. But no, the point I'm trying to make is that there were good years even before 2014, even under the NDA 1. And so to say that I was UPA, no, I have been with multiple governments over time, advising them when they are care to listen. Hopefully the point is this is for India, not for. I was very critical of UPA when I was an advisor to the Prime Minister. There is I'm sure there is a video of that, a situation in 2012. 2011, 2012, when Ishar Ahluwalia was releasing a book in honor of Dr. Manmohan Singh. And in the room, huge auditorium, event organized by ICRIER, Ishar Ahluwalia, T.N. Nainan, Dr. Zupa Rao, and me, and a fifth person at the table. And we're discussing the economic performance of the Manmohan Singh government. And three of us are really critical, starting with Ishar Ahluwalia, who's a close friend of the Prime Minister. She's critical, T.N. Nainan is critical, I am critical, and I'm sort of an economic advisor to the Prime Minister. And the Dr. Subbarao, given his office, is appropriately measured. And then the fifth person speaks, and it is the Prime Minister, Dr. Manmohan Singh.
This was in front of him.
He's sitting at the table with all of us. I mean, he's consorting with ordinary mortals. Something is unimaginable today. And he goes up and he says, look, I've heard a lot. I am not going to try and defend myself. I mean, this was to celebrate his reforms in the 1990s. Ended up being critical of what was happening in UPA and a lot of it was because the opposition was simply not cooperating in reform measures, which there were plenty of on the table. But he said, look, I've heard, and it is important for me to reflect and do something about it. And one of the consequences was that, Pranab Mukherjee went to the presidency and Mr. Chidambaram came back as finance minister, which was probably important in changing the tenor of the fiscal situation. and probably was important to do that before we were hit by the taper tantrum crisis. So I think what he heard then and what he did subsequently, who knows how much of it was influenced by that panel, but he did listen to criticism, and he didn't put us all in jail for criticizing him. That's the kind of dialogue that we need, because there's a lot that can go wrong in a complicated economy like India. And you shouldn't basically label anybody who criticizes an anti-national.
But clearly you're not anti-national, but how far would you go? Assume, purely for the purposes of argument, that the Prime Minister, the phone rang just now, it was the Prime Minister, and he said, never mind what they're saying about social media, India needs you. Will you come back and accept such and such job in my government? Would you do it?
No, I think it's not so much the job as taking the right economic steps. So I've been happy to talk to government officials, the few who call me sometimes, and tell them what I think is the right thing to do. The problem of associating with a particular government is that you get associated with all its policies.
Yeah.
And then you have the moral dilemma of, what if I don't agree with a vast majority? I mean, there's no government you'll agree with all the policies completely. It depends how fundamentally you differ on certain measures, right? And so that is a question that I will have to answer at some point whenever anything happens of that kind.
I mean, at the moment, you have to admit it sounds a lot like a no.
Well, I sort of hesitate to answer speculative questions. What will you do if doesn't such happens?
Fair enough. Let me ask you another question. Let's assume, for the purpose of argument, unlikely though it seems, that the BJP loses this election and there is an opposition government in place, and they call you and they say, look, things are a mess, come and clean them up. Would you go?
Well, whenever there has been a need, for example, when Dr. Rangarajan called me to the chief economic advisor in 2012, there was a point where we were actually in fairly deep trouble in terms of slowing growth and high debt and fiscal deficits large. But there was a need. And I didn't feel that, while I was certainly against the corruption that some of these probes at that point raised, I didn't feel that I was unsympathetic with the views of the leaders of that government, and I went. So what's important is that I feel that overall the government is going in a reasonable direction. Again, you never agree with every last detail,
but it's the direction that's important, right?
Yeah, it's the direction that's important.
There's a criticism constantly on social media that you're a great pal of Rahul Gandhi's, that you advise Rahul Gandhi, you've been called a Rahul Gandhi stooge. What's the truth?
No, look, first, I think that Rahul Gandhi is often depicted, maybe because of that, totally disfiguring interview with Arnab Goswami way back, as someone who doesn't have the capabilities to think and lead. And I think that's such a wrong portrayal in the sense that he's a smart, intelligent, and also brave. I think what people discount, which they should not, is this is a family which has seen the grandmother assassinated, the father blown up. To engage in politics, to be in the midst of crowds. I mean, if I can think of, if I had that experience, I'd be hiding on a bed all the time. Yeah. So I think there are lots of attributes which are commendable. And if you look at his record of what he's been saying on events, I think he's been right in, including during COVID, our need to do more preparation, our need to act early. And in fact, it was, Congress calling off rallies, which eventually led to stopping politicking during the second wave. But I mean, I don't want to say that he has all the answers. I don't want to say that um, uh, I mean, I just think that he is a very reasonable leader, contrary to what has been portrayed as he doesn't have the wherewithal. I think the issue more is, yeah, like with any person with, he has strong convictions. You have to debate those convictions if you disagree with them, but he's perfectly willing to engage in that debate.
Which leads to the obvious next question. There's been speculation throughout the last few months that you will join the Congress. There was speculation you would stand at this election. Was there ever anything to it?
No, I mean, look, I have said repeatedly, and people still don't believe me, that I'm an academic.
Yeah.
My business is not kissing babies. And I have I have a family and a wife who doesn't want me to enter politics for good reason, for all which I perfectly believe in. So rather than enter politics, what I would like to do is help guide where I can. And that's what I try and do. So where I feel government policy is going off track, regardless of whether I'm in government or not, I talk about it. Now, actually, I see this young guy, Dhruv Rathi, and he actually is so interesting in what he says. But one thing that he says resonates with me also. When
Mm.
people ask, are you doing all this for power? The easiest way to get power today is to succumb to the narrative and be a fellow traveler with the BJP,
Mm.
right? As you said, the chances look relatively dim. I don't think they're as dim as publicly portrayed, but I think the point is, if anybody wanted a shot at power and had no scruples whatsoever, join the ruling party. We see so many people doing it. That would be so easy. But then, you have to ask yourself, are you doing the right thing?
Something you said in that answer intrigued me. You said you have a wife who is not at all keen on your joining politics. How does your family take these incessant attacks on you, abuses in social media? I mean, you may be inured to it, but they didn't sign up for this.
They didn't. They didn't. And that's something that I have to keep in mind. But when I try my best to tell them, ignore it. It's not relevant. And my wife is a trooper. She does. But sometimes she asks, why? What are you getting out of all this? And I have to say, I mean, I really care about the country. I mean, why would I waste time? I've made a bunch of videos. I've written a book.
Hmm.
I spent the last summer, even though I was in lovely London, not going to all the attractions London has, but actually writing in a small study.
Okay.
As Rohit Lamba and I wrote this book, Breaking the Mold, to try and give an alternative vision for India,
Yeah.
saying that there is actually a spectacular vision which differs from this, let's look to the past and revive our past glory, and instead let's look to the future, not forget our past, but let's make India's future glorious. And for that, we have to do a lot of homework. So the point of that narrative, the point of that book was really, we can do it, but we don't need to dump on our minorities. We don't need to, get into, battles with other countries. That India has a long way. It can grow. It can become rich if it decides to break the mold and take a different path. And why did I write that? Well, I think before the elections, you want to put an alternative model in front of people and say, look, this model that the government is espousing, let's go back and become great at manufacturing, let's make India great again, is not really the model that is going to work. And we need a different model. But why? Because I think Indians should choose, because it's important for their destiny.
But let's talk a little bit about the economy. Many people watching this program have heard various characterizations of the economy. There's the government characterization, which is that we're galloping ahead. Most of our people have never had it so good, etc., etc. And that's gone down okay. If you look at the Lok Niti poll, you look at many polls recently, people believe they're much better off than they've ever been. So I'm not going to argue in terms of figures. There is that sense of well-being. My point is, will this continue? Do you see us as being in a good position?
Right. So well-being is going to happen, and that's what. If you are a poor country and you're growing, you are going to make people better off, right? The question is, what is the pace at which well-being is improving?
Yeah.
So if people say, "Oh, today I can use UPI, I couldn't use it 4 or 5 years ago," I mean that's true. Things will keep improving over time. It was true of the UPA, it was true of the NDA before, it is true of this NDA. The question is, are we moving fast enough and are the benefits spreading widely? So, there are some, we can get into disputes about GDP numbers, but I would say,
Let's not talk about numbers because we lose the audience.
yeah,
Let's,
yeah.
do you
I
think
would say,
do you think
we're
we're moving
growing
fast enough?
reasonably. I would say we're growing reasonably,
Yeah.
but the fruits of that growth are not reaching widely enough, right? And you've seen the government
But
sort
that's
of
but
reach.
that's two different arguments. One is, are we growing fast enough? And the other is the growth reaching the average Indian? On the
Okay,
second
so
one, I think there's
the
much
answer
more
to both is
agreement with
no.
you. What about the first one? Are we
The
growing
answer to
fast
both
enough?
is no. The
No.
answer to both is no. Right. So
Let's
when
explain
you
it.
when you say fast enough, right? The question is, how fast do we need to grow? Well, one way to think about it, which I think the Prime Minister correctly puts it, is look, he doesn't put it this way, but I'll put it this way. By 2047, we're sort of running out of our population dividend.
Yeah.
We're no longer staying young, we're starting to grow old, which means our labor force is shrinking. More and more people will be dependent on it. The time for growth is going to start ending now, as it has for China, because China's sort of population dividend was much earlier. So given that, if we need to grow rich before we grow old, we need to become developed, more or less,
Yeah.
by around 2047, which is about 24 years. Okay. Now, the problem, of course, when we say we're growing really fast, we are growing about 6% when you correct for all the fluff in the GDP numbers today, which is healthy. But at our stage of development, China and Korea were growing at 9-10%. Okay. So we look good relative to Germany, which is growing at 0, or Japan, which is growing at 1.
But there are different
But
stages of development, surely.
exactly. Poor countries grow faster. So saying we're the fastest growing country in the G20 doesn't really carry as much weight when you realize we're the poorest country in the G20 also. So as a result, we should be growing faster. Are we growing fast enough? No, relative to the pace at which these other countries were growing. So if we want to become a developed country by 2047, we should be growing at 9 and 10% today, because we will slow. As we get closer to 2047, we will slow because we'll become a more developed country by then.
Yeah.
Today, we should be growing at 10%, not 6.
So why are we
Why
are we not growing at 10%?
Because we're not doing enough in terms of creating employment. That gets to the second point, which is, is everybody benefiting? No. As you can see, the middle class and the lower middle class is suffering because it's not getting enough jobs. One statistic, and this is going to hit your viewers. The single largest source of growth in employment shares in agriculture.
Yeah.
We're increasing the share of jobs in agriculture rather than reducing them over the last few years.
Really?
This is mind-boggling. We say we're growing so fast, but we're not creating jobs in manufacturing and services. We are creating jobs in construction. The government's infrastructure program is working well.
Yeah.
But otherwise, we are just, we're not doing well on job creation. And for all the statistics, just look at how many people are applying for government jobs. You've got something like 19 million applying for railway jobs, 60,000 railway jobs. PhDs applying for jobs as peons. This is a reflection of a labor market which is simply not creating enough jobs. And so while we have the upper middle class doing really well, and you can see it in another statistic, which I'll give you. If you look at passenger car sales, they're zooming. They have gone beyond the pre-pandemic levels. If you look at two-wheeler sales, for the last decade, they've been inching up, and they are still way below the pre-pandemic level. Two-wheelers are, of course, bought by middle class and lower middle class people. So that's a clear sign that things are not well with them. And
well, the counter, which, I mean, this argument's come up before. The counter is the chaps who would have bought scooters earlier now can afford cars, which is why
such nonsense that I don't know which person is peddling this. I mean, this is just rubbish. Are you going to say that those households, those 16, 17 million households are satisfied with 1 million cars? No, I mean, these are entirely different demographic groups. And, the blatancy with which such nonsense today, I was on a panel with a government related person over the weekend. And, they were peddling, India's used to have 100 startups. Now it has 400,000 startups. I mean, again, this is nonsense. Every individual who is self-employed becomes a startup in this new definition. They are self-employed because they can't find a job. And they, rather than call themselves unemployed, they call themselves self-employed. So, I mean, yes, we can debate the statistics till the cows come home. The number of people applying for government jobs is not something you can dismiss. I mean, take even the people sitting for the IAS. The number of jobs in the IAS have not increased, but we have 3 times the number we had in the early part of the century. And why is that? Because people are not, in the early part of the century, the private sector was growing. People were not so interested in the IAS. They were moving towards private sector jobs. I mean, that's not happening anymore because the private sector jobs are not as alluring relative to the safe government job because they're not enough of them.
I take your point. I don't dispute any of your figures because those are indisputable. Those figures are there. But answer me this. If this is true, why are people continuing to vote for this government?
That's the great mystery. People don't just vote the pocketbook, of course. They vote other things. But it's also the question of whether they feel they're alone in their misery while everybody else is doing well, so it must be them. See, the dominant narrative in the mainstream press, or as in the Godi media, as Ravish Kumar would say, is...
Wonderful to see you mentioning Ravish Kumar and Dhruv Rathi. Go on.
Is that all is well.
Yeah.
We're growing so fast. The government document, the white paper that the finance minister put out, in which everything good has happened in the last 10 years, that doesn't mention the word unemployment. I actually looked for it. It doesn't mention the word unemployment. It's not there. It's absent. So, in that narrative where all is well, if you're unemployed or your son is unemployed, you feel, well, it must be us because the rest of the country is doing so well. The prime minister is inaugurating a railway station every day. It's booming. And so it must be us. So that's one part of it. The other part is it's not just about the economics, right? There are other, I've heard people say, and obviously this is important, that we now feel that we are a respected nation, and when we see Prime Minister Modi received so well by others, we have a sense of how important India is. And I think that's, I feel a sense of pride when India is taken seriously. I don't think it's just the leadership. I think it's also the country and what it stands for and the size of the country. All those things help us. But I think that there are other reasons. And,
you're actually endorsing a claim the BJP regularly makes, which many people consider controversial, which is that since this government took office, India has gained in global stature.
I don't think that's right. I'm not
You just
endorsing
said you
that
feel
claim.
proud
What
too.
I'm endorsing is the claim is India has become much more important over time, both because of its size as well as the fact that we have had growth over time,
Yeah.
and we've become more and more important. And of course, China has become the bogey person to
So the bad boy.
the bad boy. All those things have contributed, and I would say that our current leadership has taken advantage of those circumstances. Yes, I mean they could have not done that, but at the same time, remember Prime Minister Manmohan Singh was admired in the United States, including by somebody like George Bush, who painted him and has said repeatedly that he thought that we also were known for our values even when we were a small country.
Yeah.
Our democratic values, our sense of values for the world, allowed us to, in a sense, punch above our weight.
Yeah.
I think now we're punching at our weight, but our weight has become much stronger, much higher.
Ordinary people watching this show, I think many of whom in their hearts will agree with you that unemployment is a problem, that this whole manufacturing boom has not happened, the private sector has not created the jobs we expected it to, will ask you then, should we worry? Should we be optimistic? Will things be okay for us? Will there be more unemployment? Is there some kind of bust coming? What's your answer to that?
When you look at the details of our growth, it's become much more capital intensive. And one example of that is the government wanting to push chip manufacturing. Chips are the most capital intensive product you could think of making.
Okay.
They just consume money. We've now set aside $10 billion for chip subsidies. And these are, essentially capital subsidies that we'll pay upfront to set up these chip factories. That's a source of worry because those aren't going to create many jobs. Government puts out some job numbers, but those aren't going to create many jobs. What are going to create jobs? We have 300,000 chip designers. The IT minister says this. That's a lot more jobs than we'll get from chip manufacturing. But we're not creating the universities, the strong universities that would create many more, chip designers. So I think the priorities are misplaced. If you look at the IIP, the Index of Industrial Production, 12 out of 23 sectors have lower production today than they had in 2015. And typically they're labor-intensive sectors like leather, like textiles. What is succeeding in this country today is infrastructure-related industries, steel, et cetera, plus capital-intensive industries. That's not good for jobs. Our growth is skewed away. So we need to think about that. We need to rethink that and focus on how we create both a more employable workforce, but also the jobs for that workforce. And that requires serious economic thinking. It's not done by seat of pants.
The other thing that they've gone on and on about recently on social media, both sides, is the stock market. How much it grew during the UPA, how much it grew during the BJP period. What do you think is the truth? Is the stock market going to keep growing? Is it just a normal function of the way the economy is growing?
Yeah, well, I think it's when I last saw the numbers, it's the BSE Sensex has about tripled since 2014, and it did about that much, or if not a little more, under the UPA. So there's nothing spectacular about the stock market's performance. In fact, my former teachers at IIM Ahmedabad, Mr. Barua, Dr. Barua and Dr. Raghunathan wrote a piece which actually sort of showed this. But see, the stock market reflects the upper tiers of the economy, the the traded firms, as well as this mania for investment, which is now, for right or wrong, taking over the upper middle class. In the longer run, a healthy stock market is really important for an economy. So I'm actually I'm positive about that, but it doesn't reflect what's happening with the small and medium sectors, with the jobs situation, etc. And so you can't take the stock market as a full barometer of health. We have done better than a number of other countries, but also, look at the US stock market. It's at an all-time high and surging. So it's not that we're alone. It's that, a bunch of countries are doing well. I mean, if I look at the US S&P growth index, it has beaten India by, a couple of percentage points this year. So, it's good. I don't want to downplay it, but let's not take it as a full barometer of the economy's health.
So, judging by the things you're saying, let me try again and summarize them probably wrongly, but you're saying things are not gloomy or terrible in India, but we should be growing much faster. Of course, because we're on the coast growth, we'll continue growing. The question is not whether we're growing, the question is how fast we're growing. And the nature of our growth is a cause for concern, because a country like India should be able to create jobs rather than creating more jobs in manufacturing in the cities, etc. We're not. In fact, there's job growth in agriculture, which is a reversal of the normal role. So that if you were in a position of authority today, you'd be worried about unemployment, unlike the government, where it's not even mentioned in the white paper, as you say. And you're saying that, therefore, this inability of people to find jobs, the fact that so many people queue up for government jobs, is a worrying sign of what the future holds. Is that a fair summary?
It's an absolutely perfect summary, but I would also add that, there are alternatives. And, what we tried in this book, Breaking the Mold, is to offer some of them. But there is a different growth path which can be more job intensive, which can give us the stronger growth we need to get to 2047 and be a developed nation. But we need to debate that. I'm not saying we have all the right answers, but if we suppress debate and say the only true path is the one that our leaders set, I think we're not going to get to a good place.
So, is it fair to say that you're not pessimistic about India, but you're not terribly optimistic either, because you see us as squandering opportunities we have, particularly in things like the demographic dividend? You're saying that there is a window and we need to move fast if we are to take advantage of that?
Absolutely. But I would say one more thing.
Yeah.
Our strongest asset is our democracy,
Yeah.
because it allows us to correct course when we go off course. And if that democracy continues getting weakened, and every index, international index, respectable ones, show that it is weakening, if that continues weakening, then we won't be able to correct course when we go off track, because we will be stuck. And so I would say perhaps the most important element of ensuring that we have good economic growth over the next 20 years, that's a long time, 25 years, is that we preserve and strengthen our democracy. And weakening it is absolutely no option.
Without democracy, there is nothing.
There is nothing. I mean, even forget the instrumental benefits of democracy. We all love to be able to express our opinion and vote, but we will not be able to course correct. And we will go down, in a way that is going to be much more problematic if we don't have continued democracy.
You've said many, many interesting and significant things in this conversation, Dr. Rajan, but I suspect the headlines will be two. One is, no, I am not joining politics. I'm happy to advise people, but I don't want to get into it. And in any case, my wife won't let me, is one. And the other one is, yes, there were many factors that combined against me when I was in government, but don't underestimate one, which is that many businessmen, possibly influential businessmen, issued threats, perhaps veiled threats, suggesting that they wanted me out because I was working against their interests. That's a fair summary?
No, look, on the first one is fair.
You did say that.
On the second one, I want to say that is one possibility. I don't want to throw out, I know this is true.
Originally, it wasn't a possibility. You said as a fact.
No, I will accept the fact that, yes, I was certain sort of threats were communicated to me.
They were.
But I don't want to say that those were necessarily what determined the ultimate decision. What I was doing was speculating on what possibilities may have led to the break.
But you do concede, or you do reiterate that veiled threats were made to you.
Oh, yeah.
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 Okay. Dr. Rajan, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. We had a very wide-ranging conversation. I hope it gets people thinking. Thank you so much for sparing your time.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.